So Laswell was a very strong champion of the idea that content analysis needed to be a quantitative affair that focused on establishing the significance of media text by counting the things that could be objectively observed in them. And Gerbner, in his work on cultural indicators, was very much of the same mind. Gerbner wasn't interested at all in how people interpreted the same content in different ways. But what all of that disguises is the fact that there isn't really an absolute distinction between quantitative and qualitative research, in the sense that even quantitative research relies on making a series of interpretative decisions. And this, again, is an idea that can be explained in relation to video games. So, one of the other fascinating things about video games is that they really are, again, exemplars of the many difficult, interesting, and tricky decisions that we have to make when we're trying to do research, organized research, on the significance of gaming content. And it alerts us to the idea that we need to make, even if we're doing quantitative research, we need to make a series of interpretive decisions in deciding to approach media content in the way that we do. And I suppose one of the things that makes video games so interesting is the way that you really can't differentiate, make strong distinctions between media content and media users. Because, of course, in a way, there isn't really any content in a video game until someone starts to play it. And so, what this means is that video gaming, again, is a vivid exemplar of the idea that what we're really trying to do in looking at media content is explaining how media content achieves some type of social life, has a relationship to people and things that are happening elsewhere. And what this means is that content takes on many different forms. And so there's a series of things that we need to think about when we're looking at media content. And I suppose as a way of thinking about this, I want to talk about this in relation to the American comedian Sarah Silverman, who, as of 2020, achieved. Well, she's a very famous comedian, very well respected, but she had achieved some public attention for her story about the fact that she'd actually found love whilst playing Call of Duty online. So, Call of Duty is a first-person shooter, a very successful first-person shooter franchise that's very often related to World War II. So players play World War II, shoot Nazis, as Sarah Silverman would say. And of course, it's an online game as well. And that Sarah Silverman told a story about how she had started playing Call of Duty online as a way of coping with loneliness during COVID isolation. And she'd become friendly with a player online, and eventually that friendship had blossomed into a romance. And this is a great story. Not just because it's a nice story, but also because it reminds us of two things about video games. And one is that the meaning of video games is an act of social co-creation. And the other is that it's a social activity. It doesn't really make a lot of sense quite often to talk about the meaning in online gaming without talking about the motivations and indeed the social motivations behind playing a particular game. So this is particularly important because, of course, so much of the debate around content analysis in video games has surrounded the question of media violence. So there's been a lot of research on the amount of violence that there is in video games and the correlation between playing violent video games and behaving aggressively in the real world. And something that the Sarah Silverman story tells us is that those sorts of questions in some ways miss the point, or at least they don't encompass everything that there is to say about why people play video games. So for Sarah Silverman, who jokingly said, "Oh yeah, I found love whilst killing Nazis," of course, the point that she was making was is that the act of gameplay, it didn't really matter what she was doing in gameplay. It was the fact that she was doing it with somebody and striking up a relationship and having fun with somebody that was the most important thing. So this alerts us to thinking about content analysis in a way that tries to think about some of these variations. So, for example, if I can take this a little bit further, one of the points that Laswell made was that the important thing for content analysis is to look for similarities that cross different forms of media content. And again, in his work on cultural indicators, Gerbner was very much of the same mind. Now, that's not necessarily true. So, for example, the game scholar Brendan Keogh made a point of talking about a game called Special Ops The Line, particularly because it had a very different approach to media violence than other games in the first-person shooter genre. That is, Brendan Keogh argued that it was worth looking at Special Ops The Line because Special Ops The Line was unusual. It actually did things that other apparently similar games did not do, and that is it made people view the acts of violence as a moral choice. So you couldn't just shoot somebody. You had to, if you shot somebody, you had to think about the morality. The gameplay made you think about the morality of that action. So one of the things that you might do is say, well, I want to look at a particular game or a particular movie or whatever it is, because I want to talk about how this particular artifact is different from others in a similar class. Now, that works if you want to look at a particular game, and we might actually, and one of the things that's emerged, a technique that Brendan Keogh used was the technique of the walkthrough. What he did in analyzing Special Ops The Line was he actually played the game and noted down the points in the game where you were faced with a moral choice and analyzed those points. So what we have is the act of the walkthrough, the act of playing, as a form of content analysis. Now, of course, it may well be that there's still space to think about what's happening across games. That, for example, is very much the approach that Anita Sarkeesian takes, talking about recurrent patterns of gender representation across games. But every now and again, she'll stop and she'll look into how particular sorts of representations happen in a particular game. So one of the things is that she combines that kind of cross-game quantitative approach with a closer analysis of particular titles to talk about how similar kinds of sexist representations actually emerge from different industrial processes. So that's quite interesting. The other question we might ask is text or paratext. What I mean by this is that quite often, if we go back to the example of Minecraft, one of the things that we know from Minecraft is that quite often people know about Minecraft. People are exposed to Minecraft, not through the game itself, but through what Jonathan Gray calls paratexts, other forms of textual representation that reference the original game, such as the YouTube parody video. So one of the things that you might do, for example, is talk about, do a content analysis of a game, talk about how a game becomes meaningful. Actually, not by looking at the game at all, but by looking at the way it's marketed, look at the way that it's advertised, perhaps look at the way that it's critically received. So, for example, one very useful model is to look at critical reviews of games, to talk about, and what those critical reviews show is how, I suppose, a canon of gatekeepers, professional games journalists, people who other people rely on to tell us what's good and bad in the world of gaming, how they construct a particular game as something that's either worthy or not worthy of our attention. So, one of the things that we see is that Laswell's points about the importance of being really rigorous in terms of laying out your expectations and assumptions about how you're going to do your content analysis and why you're going to do it. Those things hold, but within that, there's a lot of room for more interpretive decisions. And that means that the quantitative and the qualitative can live quite happily side by side.